It was a regular Thursday evening when my world started to unravel. I had come home early from work, eager to surprise my wife, Sarah. We'd been married for 10 years, and while things had gotten routine and maybe even a little stale, I still loved her. Life has a way of sneaking in comfortable silences, and we had settled into a quiet rhythm. I thought it was enough for both of us. I parked in the driveway, grabbing the bouquet of flowers I'd picked up on a whim. Just a small gesture, hoping to rekindle the spark. Walking up to the front door, I noticed that her car was parked at an odd angle, not her usual meticulous style. Something felt off, but I brushed it off as I turned the key in the lock. The house was quiet, with only the faint hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. I headed down the hallway, expecting to find her in the kitchen or living room. Instead, I heard muffled voices coming from our bedroom, her laughter blending with a man's deeper voice. My heart pounded as my mind raced to make sense of what I was hearing. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I saw her. Sarah was lying on our bed with a man I had never seen before, laughing, touching, like they were in their own world. It felt surreal, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. My presence wasn't noticed immediately, and as I stepped closer, the reality of it hit me with a weight that nearly crushed me. The flowers slipped from my hands, petals scattering across the floor. At that moment, Sarah looked up, her face twisting from surprise to something else I couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe not. "James," she said, pulling the sheets around herself. The man scrambled up, grabbing his clothes with a look of panic and shame, but I could barely see him. My focus was on her. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice low, trying to stay calm, though every word trembled. She sat up, not meeting my eyes. "We need to talk, James," she said quietly, her voice defensive. I expected apologies, explanations, regret, but nothing prepared me for what came next. She had the audacity to blame me. "This is because of you," she began, and her words pierced like daggers. "You're never around, you're always working, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger. I needed someone who actually cares about me." The pain of betrayal hit me like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just admitting to cheating, she was justifying it. All those late nights I'd spent working, trying to build a future for us, she twisted into reasons for her actions. Anger and disbelief welled up inside me, but I forced myself to keep listening. "We barely talk anymore, James. You don't look at me the way you used to," she continued, and her tone was almost accusatory, as though this was somehow my fault. She wasn't sorry, she was angry with me. The betrayal was shocking enough, but hearing her lay the blame at my feet turned that shock into something much darker. I stood there, feeling a mix of rage, hurt, and confusion. How had things gotten so bad without me noticing? And why did she think this would somehow make her betrayal my fault? I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I needed air, space, time to clear my head. As I closed the door behind me, I felt like I was leaving more than just a room. I was leaving behind the life I thought I had. Chapter 2, The Aftermath. I drove aimlessly that night, thoughts swirling in my head, too chaotic to make sense of. A part of me wanted to scream, to break something, anything, to release the rage boiling under my skin. But another part of me was just empty. 10 years, a decade of my life, shattered in one evening, all because she felt I didn't care enough. After a few hours of driving, I found myself at the lake where Sarah and I used to come on weekends. This place held so many memories, and yet now, standing there alone, it felt tainted. I stared out at the water, the memories flooding back: the time I proposed, our quiet talks under the stars, dreams we once shared. And now it was all gone, overshadowed by betrayal. When I finally went home, It was late. I half expected Sarah to be waiting up for me, ready with apologies or explanations. But as I stepped inside, the house was dark and quiet. The only sign of her was a note on the kitchen counter. Asterisk, we need to talk about this. I'll give you space tonight, but we can't avoid it forever. Please call me. Asterisk. I crumpled the note in my fist, letting it drop into the trash can. Her words felt hollow, almost rehearsed, as though she were reading from a script of convenient excuses. Avoid it forever? Part of me thought that might be the best option. But I couldn't just run from this. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and family over the next couple of days, casual texts and questions about when we'd see each other again, blissfully unaware of the mess I was wading through. I didn't know how to explain it to them, didn't want to admit that the woman I had trusted more than anyone had betrayed me. Days passed, and Sarah kept texting, her messages alternating between apologies and accusations. One moment, she'd be saying how sorry she was, the next she'd be blaming me again, talking about how lonely she'd been, how neglected she felt. It was infuriating, and the worst part was that she sounded like she genuinely believed it. Finally, I agreed to meet her. We picked a neutral spot, a small cafe that had been one of our favorite spots once upon a time, back when things were easier. She was already there when I arrived, looking more put together than I'd expected, as if this was just another disagreement to be sorted out. "James," she said, her voice soft, her eyes pleading. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, sitting across from her, my heart pounding, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "I never meant for it to get this far," she started, as if that would somehow make everything better. I was lonely, James. You were always so busy with work, and I felt like you weren't there anymore." "Are you kidding me?" I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Do you realize how hard I've been working to build something for us? For our future? And this is how you repay me?" She sighed, looking down, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin. "You don't understand, James. It wasn't just about money or work. I needed someone who actually saw me, who wanted to spend time with me. And instead of talking to me, you decided to find it somewhere else." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't care. She looked up, eyes watering, but I couldn't tell if the tears were real or just another attempt to manipulate me. "I don't expect you to understand. You're so focused, so wrapped up in what you think is important. But you left me behind, and I was just trying to feel loved again." I leaned back, shaking my head in disbelief. The excuses she was piling on top of her betrayal were almost as painful as the act itself. Her words painted her as the victim, the one left behind, as though I hadn't sacrificed anything. All those late nights, all the times I'd missed out on things because I thought I was doing what was best for us, it all felt like it had been for nothing. "I can't do this, Sarah," I said finally, standing up. "I loved you. I thought we were in this together, but you made your choice. And now I'm making mine." She reached out, but I pulled back, not willing to give her the satisfaction of touching me, of comforting me as if she hadn't torn my heart out. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of grief and liberation. She wasn't going to twist this into my fault any longer. And as hard as it was to let go of the life I thought we'd built together, I knew I deserved better. Chapter 3, Picking Up the Pieces. The next few weeks felt like living in a haze. I went through the motions of daily life, but everything was tainted by the memories of what I'd lost, by the life I thought I'd had that no longer existed. I buried myself in work, picking up extra projects and volunteering for longer shifts. Anything to keep my mind occupied and to avoid returning to the empty house. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the day I found her in our bed with someone else. I'd get lost in the what-ifs, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if there were signs I'd missed, things I could have changed. But even as I wrestled with those thoughts, I knew deep down that her actions weren't my fault. Friends reached out, trying to get me to open up. My best friend, Mike, was the only one who knew the whole story. He'd listen, barely saying a word as I poured out my anger and hurt. But the pain never lessened. If anything, it seemed to grow sharper with every passing day. One evening, Mike convinced me to meet him at a bar. "You need to get out, man," he said over the phone. "Sitting alone in that house isn't doing you any good." Reluctantly, I agreed, and an hour later, we were nursing drinks at a corner booth. The bar was dimly lit and noisy, but it felt comforting to be around people who didn't know, who weren't part of the mess my life had become. Mike took a sip of his beer, studying me. "You look like you've barely slept." I shrugged. "What else is new?" He gave me a sympathetic look. "Look, man, I know you're going through hell. But beating yourself up over this, it's not going to change anything. You didn't do this." "She did." I nodded, knowing he was right, but still unable to shake the feeling that I should have done something differently. I just can't get past how she blamed me for it. Like I was the one who drove her into another guy's arms. "That's just her way of justifying what she did," Mike replied, leaning forward. "You can't let her guilt trip you into thinking this is your fault. You did everything you could for her. Some people they don't appreciate what they have." I stared at my drink, his words echoing in my mind. As much as I wanted to believe him, it still hurt. No amount of logic could erase the betrayal or the anger that simmered beneath the surface. But that night marked a turning point. I realized that staying angry was only hurting me, keeping me shackled to a past I couldn't change. So, little by little, I started making changes. I stopped sleeping in the master bedroom, opting for the guest room instead. I cleared out her things, boxing them up and putting them in the garage. Out of sight, out of mind. At least, that was the hope. A few days later, Sarah called. I let it go to voicemail, but her message lingered in my mind long after I'd listened to it. "James, I know you're still angry, and I understand. But we had something real, something that can't just end like this. I'm willing to try to fix things, to go to counseling, whatever it takes. I want us to have a chance to start over." Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room. How could she think we could just start over after what she did? But another part of me, one that had been with her through 10 years of memories and shared dreams, wondered if it was possible to forgive, if starting over was something I even wanted. I met with her the next day to talk, though my mind was still torn. She seemed nervous when she arrived, fidgeting with her hands as she sat across from me in the coffee shop. I barely recognized the woman in front of me, the one who had shattered everything we'd built and now looked at me with pleading eyes. "I'm sorry, James," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you. And I know you may never trust me again. But I want to make things right. I want to try." I looked at her, seeing glimpses of the woman I once loved, but the pain and betrayal lingered, creating a wall between us that felt impenetrable. "You broke us, Sarah," I said quietly. "This isn't something you can just apologize for and expect to go back to how things were. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, and I understand. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Please, just think about it." As I left that meeting, a strange sense of closure washed over me. Her words didn't heal the pain, but they reminded me that I didn't owe her anything anymore. I didn't owe her forgiveness or a second chance. Maybe someday I'd find a way to let go of the anger, but that didn't mean I had to let her back into my life. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I started going to the gym again, picked up old hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside. Gradually, I began to feel like myself again, maybe even a better version of myself. I was still hurt, but I was healing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The past was behind me, and I was finally ready to face the future. Chapter 4, Rediscovering Myself. Life slowly began to regain its rhythm. I was no longer waking up in the middle of the night with a heavy weight on my chest, and the ache of betrayal dulled as time passed. I still thought of Sarah occasionally, but each day brought a bit more distance from the pain. I was beginning to see that I wasn't just healing from the betrayal, I was rediscovering who I was without her. Mike continued to check in, and I was grateful for his support. He was the kind of friend who didn't sugarcoat things, and he kept me grounded whenever I started spiraling into self-blame. "Dude, have you thought about joining that hiking group I told you about?" he asked one evening as we sat on his patio. "It's been a great outlet for me, and you'll meet some cool people too." At first, I brushed off the idea. I'd never been much of a hiker, and the thought of joining a group of strangers felt overwhelming. But after some prodding, I gave in. The next Saturday, I found myself on a trail with a dozen other people, surrounded by towering trees and fresh mountain air. To my surprise, it felt good. It felt freeing. The group hiked together every weekend, and over time, I started to feel like I belonged there. I'd have easy conversations with people who knew nothing about my past, who saw me simply as James, the guy from the Saturday hike. No one knew about the pain I'd gone through, and it was refreshing to be seen without the weight of my broken marriage hanging over me. One Saturday, as we were trekking up a steep incline, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Emma. She was kind, easy to talk to, with a laugh that felt like a breath of fresh air. There was no awkwardness, no tension, just two people enjoying a shared experience. Over time, Emma and I began to talk more during the hikes, and soon enough, we were meeting for coffee after each one. The change was subtle at first, but over time, I noticed that the hole Sarah had left was slowly closing. Emma wasn't a replacement, she was a reminder that life could be good again, that I could share my time with someone who valued it without hidden expectations or unresolved resentments. I didn't tell her about my past right away, but one evening, as we were sitting at the lake where I'd once gone to grieve, the truth spilled out. She listened quietly, her eyes warm and understanding, never interrupting. When I finished, she simply nodded. "It's understandable that you'd be cautious, James. Trust doesn't come back overnight. And honestly, it shouldn't have to." Her words struck a chord. For so long, I had felt that my struggle to trust was a flaw, something that needed to be fixed. But Emma made me see it differently. Trust was something that had to be rebuilt, yes, but in its own time. And perhaps, more importantly, I had to trust myself again before I could truly trust someone else. Our friendship deepened, and eventually, those lines blurred into something more. It wasn't like the start of my relationship with Sarah, which had been filled with the intensity of young love. With Emma, it was different. It was steady, gentle, and filled with respect. I didn't feel the need to prove anything, nor did she. We were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company, who brought out the best in each other. A year passed, and I could hardly recognize the man I'd been when Sarah shattered my heart. I had discovered new parts of myself, shed old wounds, and found peace in the quiet spaces of my life. One evening, Emma and I returned to the lake, the place where so much had shifted for me. She sat beside me, her hand finding mine, and in that moment, I knew I had finally found closure. "Thank you," I said, squeezing her hand. She looked at me, surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to be happy again." Her smile was soft, but there was an understanding in her eyes. "You did that for yourself, James." I was just here. Looking out at the lake, I realized she was right. I had come through the storm, not unscathed but stronger. And as we sat there in comfortable silence, I knew I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it held. Chapter 5, A New Beginning. In the months that followed, life settled into a pattern that felt both familiar and new. Emma and I continued to grow closer, each step we took grounded in trust and honesty. It was the kind of relationship I'd always hoped for but had never truly experienced, one where I didn't feel like I was constantly trying to keep up or prove myself. With her, I could just be. One Saturday, we decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin nestled in the mountains. It was simple and secluded, surrounded by towering trees and the kind of peace you can only find miles from city life. We spent the days hiking, exploring trails that wove through forests and led to stunning views of untouched landscapes. And at night, we'd sit by the fire, wrapped in blankets, talking for hours or just enjoying the quiet. On our second night there, as we were watching the fire crackle and cast shadows across the walls, Emma turned to me. Her face softened as she looked at me, and I felt the familiar warmth that had grown between us over the past year. "You know, James," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "I never really asked you, but, are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in so long, and I hadn't asked myself either. I thought about it for a moment, really letting it sink in. For years, I'd equated happiness with stability and security, with the life Sarah and I had tried to build. But now, I saw it differently. Happiness wasn't about checking off boxes on a life plan. It was about feeling at peace, about finding joy in the small moments, and about being with someone who didn't expect me to be anything other than myself. "Yes," I said, looking at her, feeling the truth of that word resonate deeply. "I really am." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that spoke volumes. She didn't need to say anything more, she just squeezed my hand and leaned her head on my shoulder, the firelight dancing around us. The next day, as we hiked up a trail that led to a cliff overlooking a valley, I found myself thinking about everything I had been through to get to this point. All the nights spent wrestling with my pain, the hours in that empty house that used to be a home, the long conversations with Mike that kept me grounded, it had all led me here. Standing on that cliff, overlooking the valley, I realized I had finally left the past behind. I had forgiven myself, learned to trust myself again, and found someone who accepted me without hesitation or judgment. When we returned to the cabin, Emma took a deep breath and looked at me with a question in her eyes. "What do you want your life to look like, James? What do you see for yourself in the future?" It was a question that might have once felt daunting, but not anymore. I didn't need a detailed answer, I just knew that whatever the future held, I was finally ready for it. "I want more of this," I said simply. "Moments that matter. I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I know I want you there with me." Her face softened, and she wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt like the culmination of every healing moment we'd shared. In the end, there was no grand declaration, no sweeping finale. Just the quiet knowledge that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The pain of the past had been a chapter, but it didn't define me. I had turned the page and found something better, something real. And for the first time, I was genuinely, completely at peace. Chapter 6, The Road Ahead. As the months rolled on, Emma and I settled into a life that felt both comforting and exciting. We found joy in the smallest things, cooking together in my tiny kitchen, making each other laugh over silly inside jokes, or discovering new trails and places to explore. What surprised me most was how natural it all felt, how easy it was to be with her. There was no pretense, no need to try and be anyone other than who I truly was. I gradually introduced her to my family and friends. Everyone noticed the change in me, the happiness that seemed to radiate just under the surface. Mike, who had been my rock through the hardest times, pulled me aside after meeting her and gave me a nod of approval. "She's good for you, man," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You're finally living again." And he was right. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. One evening, after a day of hiking and exploring, Emma and I returned home, exhausted but happy. As I was unpacking, I found an old box in the closet that I hadn't opened since the day I'd packed Sarah's things away. I hesitated, my hand lingering on the lid. Part of me wanted to throw it out, to erase every trace of that chapter of my life, but another part felt the need for closure. Emma noticed me standing there, and without a word, she came over and took my hand. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. We sat on the floor, and I opened the box. Inside were old photos, mementos of my past life with Sarah, our wedding album, notes we'd written each other, souvenirs from trips we'd taken. I felt a twinge of sadness, but also a sense of peace. I wasn't angry anymore, just ready to let it all go. Together, Emma and I sifted through the items, laughing at some, quietly reflecting over others. With each item we set aside, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. By the time we were done, I realized that I didn't need these reminders anymore. I'd held onto the memories, the pain, far too long. Now, they were just pieces of a story I'd outgrown. We took the box outside, and under the stars, I let each item go, burning some in our small fire pit, donating others. When it was done, I felt an immense sense of relief, as though I had finally released the last remnants of the past. As we sat in the quiet of the evening, Emma leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice a gentle murmur in the night. "Lighter," I replied, realizing just how true that was. "I feel like I'm finally free." The months turned into a year, and our lives began to intertwine in ways I hadn't anticipated. One day, after we had come back from a long weekend of hiking and exploring, I found myself looking around my house, no longer filled with the shadows of a broken past, but with warmth, laughter, and love. This was home, and it felt right. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Emma looked at me with a soft smile. "James, I know we've never really talked about it, but, do you see a future for us?" There was no doubt in my mind. She had been my friend, my confidant, my partner in healing and happiness. I wanted her by my side for every chapter of the life I was building. I took her hands, looking into her eyes. "Emma, you're my future. I don't know where life will take us, but I know I want you there with me." She smiled, her eyes glistening, and in that moment, I knew we were truly beginning something beautiful, something unbreakable. Together, we had built a life founded not on expectations or past traumas but on trust, honesty, and love. We had both come from places of hurt, but we had healed side by side, creating a bond that was stronger for the challenges we'd faced. As we stood there in the quiet of our home, hand in hand, I realized that I had found something rare. I hadn't just found love again, I'd found a life worth living, a life built on the ashes of the past but reaching toward a hopeful, vibrant future. And as I held her close, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Chapter 7, A Promise of Forever. Life continued to unfold in ways that surprised and delighted me. The peace I'd found with Emma wasn't just a fleeting happiness, it felt grounded, as if our connection had deep roots. Over time, we built traditions of our own: Friday night dinners with friends, weekend road trips to places we'd never been, quiet evenings spent talking about everything and nothing at all. Each moment felt like another step in creating the life I'd always hoped for but had never been able to envision so clearly. One evening, as we sat together on the patio under a clear night sky, I felt a growing certainty about the direction my life was taking. It was Emma who had gently pulled me forward from my past, showing me that I could still find joy and trust. Now, I wanted to offer her that same certainty, that same sense of permanence. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stars as I gathered my thoughts. "Emma, I said, my voice soft but steady, "Do you remember when you asked me if I saw a future for us?" She nodded, smiling as she looked over at me, her expression warm and patient. Well, I realized that I don't just see a future. I want to build one with you. I don't want just today or next year, I want forever. A surprised look flashed across her face, followed by the kind of joy that radiates so naturally from the heart. She reached for my hand, her grip both gentle and firm. "James, I've known for a long time now that my future is with you." In that moment, I realized I didn't need a grand gesture or a ring. I didn't need perfect timing or a rehearsed speech. I just needed her, here and now. As we sat beneath the stars, I made her a promise, a quiet vow spoken from a place of certainty and love. I promised to stand by her, to be there through the highs and lows, to offer her the same kindness and patience that she had given me. The months that followed were filled with quiet planning as we decided to make things official. We didn't want a huge ceremony, just an intimate gathering with a few close friends and family. We chose a beautiful spot on one of the hiking trails where we had spent so many weekends, the place where we'd first felt a connection strong enough to carry us forward together. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone brightly, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Mike stood by my side, grinning as he gave me a reassuring pat on the back. Emma walked down the path toward me, her face lit with a smile that seemed to carry all the love and happiness of the world. As we exchanged our vows, I felt the last remnants of the past truly fade away. I was no longer the man defined by betrayal and loss, I was a man standing with a future full of promise. With Emma, I'd found something that transcended the pain I'd once known. She was my friend, my confidant, my partner, and now, my wife. We didn't need grand gestures or perfection. We simply needed each other, and that was more than enough. After the ceremony, we celebrated with our closest friends and family, laughter and love filling the air. There was no pretense, no pressure, just the joy of being surrounded by the people who had supported us both through everything. As the evening came to a close, Emma and I took a quiet moment away from the crowd, standing together beneath the trees, hand in hand. She looked up at me, her eyes full of that familiar warmth that had drawn me to her in the first place. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment, and then I smiled. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, with exactly who I'm meant to be with." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. For the first time in a long time, I felt at home truly and completely. The past had been difficult, yes, but it had led me here. And as we walked back toward the celebration, hand in hand, I knew that we were stepping forward into a future full of love, peace, and the kind of happiness that only grows stronger with time. It was the beginning of forever. Chapter 8, Building Our Life Together. After the wedding, life settled into a beautiful, comforting rhythm. Emma and I found joy in the small things: morning coffee together, quiet evenings on the couch, spontaneous trips to the mountains on weekends. Our days weren't always exciting or eventful, but they were ours, and that alone made them meaningful. We worked together to create a home that reflected both of us, a space where laughter and peace coexisted, a place filled with reminders of our shared memories and plans for the future. We repainted rooms, added little touches here and there, and even started a garden in the backyard. Emma loved plants and could spend hours tending to them, and watching her passion for this new project filled me with a quiet happiness I hadn't known before. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Emma brought up something I hadn't expected. "Have you ever thought about kids, James?" I looked over at her, surprised but not shocked. I'd thought about it here and there, but I wasn't sure how to broach the subject, especially given all the changes we'd been through in recent years. "I have," I admitted, a bit unsure. "But I don't know if I'd be any good at it." Emma's laughter was soft but sincere. "You're good at everything you do, James. And you'd make a wonderful father." We sat in silence for a few moments, letting the idea settle between us. A family. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. But when I looked at Emma, I realized that whatever fears I had, they weren't enough to keep me from wanting this new chapter with her. Over the next few months, the idea of starting a family grew, and eventually, it became more than a dream, it became a reality. The day we found out Emma was pregnant, our world shifted once more. I held her close, feeling a mix of excitement, fear, and awe. It was a new beginning, a chance to build something lasting, something that felt bigger than either of us. Pregnancy brought its own challenges and joys. We spent hours reading parenting books, decorating a nursery, and wondering about the future. Friends and family showered us with support, filling our home with well wishes and gifts for the baby. Mike and my family were especially excited, rallying around us in a way that reminded me of how lucky we were to have such a supportive circle. When the time finally came, and Emma went into labor, I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. Hours later, when I held our newborn daughter in my arms for the first time, a wave of emotion washed over me, love, gratitude, and a sense of purpose I'd never experienced. She was perfect, with a soft wisp of hair and eyes that peered up at me, almost as if recognizing me. Emma, exhausted but glowing, smiled as she watched me hold our daughter. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" "She is," I whispered, feeling the full weight of fatherhood settle in. "Just like her mom." We named her Lily, and from that day on, our lives were filled with new challenges, sleepless nights, and moments of pure joy. Watching Emma with Lily only deepened my admiration and love for her. She was patient, caring, and so naturally good at being a mother. I was in awe of her strength, and it made me even more committed to being the best husband and father I could be. Raising Lily wasn't always easy, but it was worth every late night and every moment of uncertainty. I found myself discovering new sides of myself, learning patience, finding joy in small things, and embracing the chaos that came with fatherhood. There were nights when Lily wouldn't sleep, and we'd take turns rocking her, laughing quietly at our own exhaustion, and mornings where her smile was the only thing we needed to start the day right. One afternoon, as Lily took her first steps between us, Emma and I locked eyes, both of us overwhelmed by the sheer magic of the moment. We had come a long way from those dark, difficult days, and now, standing here in our home with our daughter giggling between us, I knew that everything we'd been through had led us to this. Emma squeezed my hand, and in her eyes, I saw the same gratitude and love that I felt. We had built a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and hope. The wounds of the past had healed, and in their place, we had created something unbreakable. As Lily grew, our family's bond only deepened. Our life wasn't without its challenges, but they were challenges we faced together, strengthened by the journey we'd been through and the love we'd nurtured. And every day, as I looked at my family, I felt a profound sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be. In the end, the pain of the past had been a part of my story, but it didn't define me. Love, resilience, and the quiet strength that Emma had shown me were what had truly shaped my life. I had learned that, even after the darkest storms, there is light waiting on the other side. And as I watched Lily laugh and play, with Emma by my side, I knew I had found my forever.